Gared is our weeds field specialist in the Aberdeen Regional Center.
All right, we're back.
We're back.
All
It's all
right, sorry
yours.
about that. Man, we are a real positive group today. We're talking about regulations, drought, disease. Now we're talking about weeds, and you're going to follow up insects. So you farmers have a tough job. Um, so yeah, not super positive, I guess, but it needs to be talked about. One second, let me rearrange my screen here a little bit. There we go. So most of you are aware of Palmer amaranth. It was found first in the state in 2014. We want to keep talking about this, just keep people aware of it actually is in the state. And we have found it at a few different locations throughout the years. It's mainly come in through either seed, the big ones have been combines or any kind of harvesting equipment. This is a picture here. There's actually a secretary at Letha in the Pierre Regional Center. They found this Palmer amaranth plant. Obviously, it had plenty of water and nutrients. They found it in an irrigated cornfield, I think, down by the Missouri River. Usually doesn't get that big, but it can, given the right opportunity. So can water hemp or any other weed. But just be aware of this. There's the best way to ID Palmer amaranth versus water hemp is ripping off. You can actually see this is Ruth Beck's hand. She's an agronomist, or she's retired now in Pierre. If you rip it off so you can see where the stem here is, if you fold that back on a Palmer amaranth plant, it's always that stem's gonna be longer than the leaf itself. Now, a water hemp plant, that stem would probably end somewhere in this region, if you can see my cursor there on the top of that leaf. So it's gonna be shorter than the leaf itself. So that's one key feature with Palmer versus water hemp to tell. And if you want more information on Palmer, maybe Matt or somebody can throw this link up in the chat box or something. So myself, Sarah Bowder, and Ruth Beck, we made the pamphlet, a little booklet about how to ID Palmer amaranth. So you can get a paper version of this at any of the regional centers. I know Aberdeen, Mitchell has them, Sioux Falls, Watertown, probably even Lemon might even have it. But it helps a lot just to know what to look at. And there's colored pictures there to help out a bunch, especially versus water hemp. So again, majority of the Palmer amaranth we're finding has been in the Missouri River Valley area, the counties touching the Missouri River. There's been a few outside of that, especially in the southern border of the state, a few occurrences of this. But in general, we have kept a pretty good rap on it, I think. And producers are doing a good job of disposing of it and getting rid of it. But in general, we just want to keep up on trying to decrease its stronghold in South Dakota because it is in North Dakota. It's been in Nebraska for a long time. And of course, as you go south into Kansas, it's a major problem. It's just as across Kansas is basically as bad as water hemp is in the eastern part of South Dakota. So, and if you want my contact information here, if you think you might have Palmer amaranth, definitely give me a call here at the office in Aberdeen or email me or something, a picture, and I will gladly try to contact you and you maybe even see it in person to make sure we get a good proper ID on that species that you found. So a little bit, I'm going to talk about weed control and dry conditions. Mainly, I know some people right now might not be super drought situation in the southern part of the state, southeast, but just looking at drought conditions in corn, soybeans, it could happen. That's what they're talking about. So I'm going to focus on that for a few minutes here and look at weed control in those dry conditions. So weed emergence in dry conditions. So weed emergence in general can be very erratic, especially depends on when you get rain. So if we get a dry spell here in the spring, you get everything planted, and then you have nothing really growing weed-wise, and then we get a good flush of rain late May, June, you're going to see a massive flush of weeds, or even into late June, you get rain and then get another flush of weeds. So it can be really erratic, maybe even delayed. Like I said, the spring could have a decreased weed emergence if it's really dry in your area. Then all of a sudden, we start getting rain later in May, we might see more flushes come through. But again, drought-tolerant weeds, of course, are more troublesome in dry years, like kochia, Russian thistle. Kochia more central part of the state, southern, and then Russian thistle more west, I guess. And then also perennial weeds do a little more troublesome because they are the ones that can handle the drought better than an annual weed like waterhemp likes moisture. So in a dry year, waterhemp won't do as well. It will grow, of course, but it won't do as well in these really dry conditions if we do get really warm and really hot like we have in the past. And then some strategies, of course, soil applied. You're going to hear this from chemical company reps, from extension specialists. Of course, always rely on soil applied herbicide to get those early emerging weeds. And again, it's easier to kill, especially these tough ones like kochia, water hemp, if you can get it out there early enough to get those early emerging weeds. It's easier to kill them before they come out of the ground than it is after they're already up. But again, in a dry situation, you got to have moisture to, of course, incorporate that into the soil. And of course, there's always a debate, well, should I physically incorporate? Is that going to help the situation in a dry year? Potentially on some chemicals it would, but you still need moisture to get that in the soil solution so the plants can take it up. If it's super dry, if you till the soil, it's super dry, the chemical is going to be there, but it's not going to be easily taken up by the weeds because it's so dry. In a no-till situation, you need water to move it down into the soil profile, especially that first inch, half inch, so those weeds can take it up and kill them, hopefully before emergence even happens. But again, soil applied herbicide may eliminate early season competition. So majority of crops, that first 4 to 6 weeks, research has found that those are the weeks that most yield reduction happens when weed competition is there, present. Is that why we want to get those weeds under control quickly? When you look at a graph, weeds that come up after 6 weeks from like corn emergence are not near as hindering. Of course, it depends on the intensity of the weed pressure, but in general, you're not going to see as much pressure that's going to affect yield later on in the corn development, and so the soybeans as well. It just, again, it depends on how much weeds are there, etc. That's why I think we should take the advantage of the fall, especially in South Dakota. There's a lot more options out there. It depends on weather, of course, in the fall, if you can get out there, how cold it is, etc. But the fall applied options are a lot in South Dakota, especially when you're dealing with mare's tail, early emerging kochia, other winter annuals that you can control in the fall with a single chemical application. They can be cheap compared to some of these even post options that we are fighting weeds with. And you can use these as a burn down residual in the fall, and or do a split applied option. Some of these pre-emergent corn herbicides, even some soybean, you can apply. We could do maybe, so let's say if the rate's 2 quarts an acre, you could do a half rate in the fall, and then do another rate, another half rate in the spring, and then come back with another early post. That might be beneficial for you because in general, especially dry areas of the state, like central South Dakota, there's not going to be enough moisture there in a normal year, especially not in a dry year, to get enough moisture to activate that herbicide in the soil. Now, if you're in the southeast part of the state, southern part of the state, maybe far east, I-29 corridor, you probably won't run into this issue, but you go central part of the state, west of 281 for sure, you could definitely run into some issues with getting enough moisture to activate that pre-emergent herbicide. That's why they did some research way in the past, like 30 years ago, when I was probably just a young kid at SDSU in the central part of the state, just looking at these split applied herbicides, and it actually helps a lot because you're grabbing more moisture throughout the wintertime to activate that herbicide to hinder these early emerging weeds like kochia in that scenario. And like I said, there's lots of options. These are just coming, you can look at the chemical books, all these products are in there. I'm just going to kind of give you an overview. So again, if you have an option to spray when it's colder, if you have a warm place to put your sprayer so it doesn't freeze. And again, when it comes to contact herbicides, yeah, you want to be spraying when it's above 55 degrees, at least for a few days to get better control. But these herbicides give you a good residual control. And most of these, they want you to spray it when it's cooler. Of course, you have to deal with the sprayer and if you're hiring somebody, they might not want to do it. And depends on your crop rotation, et cetera. There's all kinds of issues that you can run into. But in general, like Valor application, there's a lot of research that, so if you put Valor in the fall, that will definitely help kochia in the spring, because kochia can be emergent at 39 degrees Fahrenheit ground temperature. We've definitely went over that in a lot of areas in South Dakota already. So it could be already up and growing. And that's pretty cheap. I mean, one application of Valor or Panther's, another brand of that same chemical, that can be way cheaper than a fall tillage application, and can definitely help you out when it comes to weed control this spring. And there's, again, a lot of options here. Most of these, they don't want you to apply it to frozen or snow covered ground, but they want you to apply a lot of these after October 15th in South Dakota. So just be aware of that. And there's other options here. For example, dual Magnum, you can S-metolachlor, you can do that 1 to 2 pints after September 30th before ground freezes. So you just gotta look at the labels. There's a lot of options out there. More like corn-oriented ones, soybean ones. Here, Authority products. You can use those in the fall. So right here, Authority Elite, they want you to apply after September 30th when soil temperature is less than 55 degrees, but not frozen or snow covered. So again, in South Dakota, that might not give you a very big window in some places, maybe not at all, but at least look at the scenario and see what's going on. So some corn products like Harness, acetochlor, use that, apply after October 15th, but before soil freezes. That will help a lot with early kochia emergence, especially on a wet spring. Some of these are great. So in the fall, usually we're not as wet, usually. Spring could come, you won't have time to get out there. It could be too wet to get those down soon enough. And again, it's easier to control some of these weeds, especially kochia, before it emerges. That's what many universities have found that have issues with it, especially south of us, like Kansas. All right, so post-emergent. So post-emergent advantage, there is an advantage to that, but at the same time, if you're relying on a post-emergent, it's going to be less effective in dry versus wet conditions. And of course, if it's extremely wet, if you have wet leaves, that's going to be even more of a deterrent, because of course, the more water you have on the leaves at application, you're basically decreasing, you're diluting your chemical down, and that's not as effective either. But in a dry scenario, leaf orientation is going to change. So on a hot day, of course, towards the end of the day, you're going to have a leaf droop. But in the early morning, you go out there in the early morning, let's say, of course, we look at labels, we want to avoid inversion. So we wait until 8 or whatever, an hour after sun up, that leaf orientation is going to be up because it's trying to get sunlight. That's the best time to spray, when leaf orientation's at least up and somewhat horizontal, not all drooped over, especially on contact herbicides. And again, for post-emergent, you actually can evaluate how much weed issue you possibly could have. So you might not have to have a pre-emergent. I know places that you don't even need one. Or some guys I know that just apply a pre-emergent and that's it. They basically just leave their corn and let it go. They have very little weed issues. So it depends on your scenario. If you have a lot of weeds, again, this gives you a time period to evaluate before spending the money. Because I know some of these pre-emergents are super expensive, and some of these post options aren't super cheap either. But it just gives you opportunity to know what you're going to do and what not to do. So management. And again, field conditions may not allow application. There's multiple weed flushes may complicate the situation. So if you apply an early post and then there's no residual there, you have a lot of weed issues. If your crop's, of course, too far along, you might lose opportunity to control some of those weeds. And then additives, there's always a question of what I should add, especially in hot environments when it gets warm during the summer. Some of these are going to improve weed control, but you got to use them with caution, because some of these they say do not use under certain conditions, especially dry, hot. Because if the corn crop or the soybean crop's under stress already and you just stress it more, using like crop oil with a product, you're probably going to have leaf burn. You might hinder, of course, your cash crop at the same time. So be aware of what the herbicide label says on additives like crop oil, stuff like that with the herbicide. And then of course your crop size, so how far along is the crop, weed growth stage, weed condition, environmental conditions, etc. But again, they're going to help you in general to absorb the chemical, because a lot of those contact additives are going to help absorb that chemical into the plant, even in drier scenarios. And then stress versus no stress. So I talked about temperature. So what's the optimum? So again, over 90, of course, besides just some of those volatile chemicals are going to be very volatile above 90. But again, you want it between, I would say 65 to mid 80s are probably the best. But again, you got to do what you got to do in general. But so not too hot, not too cold for especially contact herbicides. You'll have crop injury issues as well if not properly taken care of. And then also I say here, so weeds are less tolerant because in dry scenarios, that thicker wax layer on the leaf surface gets a lot thicker, and it's harder for the herbicide to penetrate it, besides just leaf orientation. And also translocation metabolism slows. So that herbicide, especially a systemic herbicide, needs to be taken in the plant, and if you don't have water, then it's of course going to be hard to swallow it as a plant. So if we have a dry mouth, it's hard for us to swallow a pill unless you get some water. Same thing with the plant, can't get that herbicide in unless it has some liquid with it. Even if you're applying it at 20 gallons per acre, it still needs to be a plant that's not super stressed out because of moisture problems. And then, of course, systemic herbicides of most concern, like I said, that's why, because they got to move in the plant, contact not as much. And then again, adjuvants, we worried about crop injury. There's many factors for carryover. So one problem with the dry conditions is a potential of carryover, because without moisture, you're not getting the soil solution. You possibly not have hydrolysis happen in the soil, which that breaks down some chemicals, or you might not have enough microbial activity in the soil, and that breaks down chemicals. So you might have more carryover due to that. So chemical half-life is one of those factors. So how long is that chemical going to last in the soil? We kind of know that. Herbicide rate, it depends on your rate. Application date, so is a late application still on label though, you're going to have a more carryover versus if you applied that early post instead of later. Soil characteristics, so texture, organic matter, pH, all comes into factors. Of course, rainfall, we talked about that. Sensitivity to rotational crops, you got to know what the label says, rotational restrictions, and if it's going to be super dry after application, then you can probably bet on at least go into that rotational restriction that's on the label and maybe even add in more months to it. Depends on moisture and your soil conditions after that point. And then carryover factors, more of them. So it could be cool. So we experienced this a couple years ago, last couple years, I guess, before it got dry. It was really wet. So we had cool, wet summers that can also affect herbicide carryover as well versus drought. But again, moisture usually in general helps degrade it because it's in that soil solution. And it can be taken up by plants. It can be decomposed through microbes or something like that. And there are some herbicide, of course, carryover levels, or some are higher than others. Some high-risk chemicals would be something like atrazine, could be fomesafen, or first rate is a chemical that could have issues. Moderate risk would be more like lower rates of atrazine would be lower risk. Prowl, stuff like that. And then of course your no risk would be all your post grass herbicides, anything contact, stuff like that, remoxanil, things like that. So there's a lot of things that break down chemicals. I'm just going through this real fast. So in general, we think a lot about photodecomp, especially in a drier situation. That's going to be it. So if that pre-emergent, it's super dry, you apply it, it never rains for the first month after you apply it, a lot of those chemicals will photodegrade really fast on top of the soil. That's why we want to apply it and get about a half inch of moisture within a week or two would be optimum, even quicker maybe. But not too much moisture, because then you got leaching problems, and that's a whole nother issue. And then or surface runoff can be an issue. And then of course we've been talking about dicamba and volatility, etc. But actually a little bit of moisture right after application of dicamba, of course, staying on the label, I think it's 4 hours until it's rain fast. So if you get a little moisture, it's okay after that point. But Again, that's a lot of factors in how chemicals degrade and stay in the soil. And then just looking ahead too, when it comes to carryover, field biolasing is always key. One way to do it is just plant some strips in your field before you plant the cash crop and see what, or it's a cover crop or something like that, see what grows. In South Dakota, we don't have a lot of time because of our growth season is very short. So you can just get soil across the whole field. A good example of that, put it in a pot and get some soil that's similar to that, made in the same field that wasn't applied herbicide. You know it's clean. In a different pot, put the seeds in there, and usually within a week you can see if there's going to be issues in that. And of course, carryover is more likely in field entrances, field edges, turnaround areas, eroded hills, extreme pH areas, especially over 7, low areas, stuff like that. Since it's already 12:31, I'm going to have to skip ahead a little bit in general. I did want to mention one thing about resistance, since I try to mention this every year in PATs. Just because we have new chemicals out there doesn't mean we're kind of set. We got to make sure we're using those properly and not abusing those. Here's an example with Roundup. This is in Kansas. I went to Kansas State University, grew up in Kansas. They found this population of kochia that could tolerate very high amounts of glyphosate Roundup because it was used over and over and over again year after year. And some of you probably experienced this maybe as well. But this plant on the very far right here, it actually increases copy numbers. So what glyphosate actually attacks, increase that, and it withstood 120 fluid ounces. And it looks like that on the far right there. It survived it. And an example from Nebraska, they did some research on dicamba and resistance in dicamba and kochia. And they found similar stuff in waterhemp as well. But if you look at this top one here, is dicamba dose. So this rate, so at a 0.5 rate, if I can make this right, that's 16 fluid ounces of clarity here that it survived right there. And then you double that. So that's 32 ounces. That's 64 ounces of clarity it survived. And then up here would be, 128 fluid ounces this plant survived. So they kept increasing the rates, and they saw kochia have very high resistance to dicamba. It was clarity in this situation. So in general, again, a full rate, 16 ounces, should have killed it in a good world. So biotech gives us great products, but at the same time, we got to be aware that they're not a silver bullet. So if you have any questions, give me a call, and I'll be glad to talk to you. All right, and then my contact information right there. All right, thank you.
Hey, Gared, there are also, I think, a couple of questions in the Q&A for you. So as we switch to the next presentation, if you want to take any of those, that would be awesome. I just wanted to point you to those since they came in while you were talking.